At exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed to life, its blue glow piercing the stillness of our Boston brownstone. The message on the screen was from Francis, my husband of 30 years. He was in Bali, halfway across the world, but his words cut through the time zones like a blade. Sold our Cape Cod beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless. Lol. Don't bother calling. I stared at the text, my hands trembling. That was it. 3 decades together reduced to a few cruel lines and an emoji. I set the phone down, inhaled deeply, and reached for the folder I had been building for months, because I had seen this coming. My name is Alice Mercer. At 52, after 30 years of marriage, my husband tried to leave me with nothing but a text message. Stay with me to see how I turned his betrayal into justice and left him with nothing but regret. Alice Mercer had always been the calm center of the storm. As a seasoned hospital administrator in Boston, she was known for her precision, discretion, and grace under pressure. She managed crises daily, shortages, patient complaints, legal threats, but nothing had prepared her for the unraveling of her own marriage. At home, Alice was the steady hand that kept the household running smoothly. For 3 decades, she had supported her husband Francis through his fluctuating career in commercial real estate, standing beside him during market crashes and celebrating his rare wins. Their life together wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Or so she believed. Francis hadn't always been distant. In their early years, he was charming and ambitious, full of ideas for real estate ventures and weekend getaways. But over time, he grew cold. The changes were subtle at first, a shift in how he looked at her, shorter answers. Then out of nowhere, Francis developed an obsession with fitness. After years of ignoring Alice's gentle nudges about his health, he suddenly joined an elite gym and hired a personal trainer, Jessica, a woman half his age. Alice wanted to be supportive, though she found the timing odd. Francis started disappearing for hours, claiming training sessions that became more frequent and more expensive. Soon, his mood changed. He became irritable, snapping at her questions and dismissing concerns about mounting credit card charges. When she noticed passwords being changed on their joint accounts, Francis brushed it off as a security update. "You're too trusting," he told her with a smirk. That line would echo in Alice's mind for months. Friends started asking questions. They noticed Francis's sudden glow-up, his flirtatious behavior at parties, and the way he talked about Jessica a little too often. But whenever someone raised a red flag, Alice instinctively defended him. "He's just trying to take better care of himself," she'd say. "He's under a lot of stress." It was easier to explain away his behavior than confront the possibility that everything she'd built her life around was falling apart. But Alice wasn't blind. She saw the signs. Francis stopped consulting her about major decisions. He became secretive with his phone. He claimed to be on business trips, yet Jessica's Instagram posts from matching hotel balconies told a different story. Alice knew she needed to act, not react, so she turned to what she knew best: documentation, analysis, and quiet preparation. Every suspicious transaction was recorded. She printed bank statements, photographed receipts, and saved screenshots of Jessica's social media posts. She made copies of their property deeds and stored them in a secure location. She consulted their longtime family attorney, Diane, who encouraged her to build a paper trail before making any moves. "If he's planning what I think he's planning," Diane warned, "you'll need proof to protect yourself." Alice moved quietly, methodically. She hired a forensic accountant to dig deeper and discovered a second bank account in Francis's name, opened without her knowledge. She found drafts of emails he had written to real estate agents about quietly listing their beloved Cape Cod beach house, property that had been in her family for 4 generations. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was strategic, calculated, cold. In the midst of it all, Alice remained outwardly composed. She continued managing her team at the hospital, caring for patients, and attending meetings as though her world wasn't crumbling behind the scenes. But at night, she added to the thick folder of evidence growing in her desk drawer. Because Alice Mercer wasn't just documenting her husband's betrayal, she was preparing to make sure he didn't get away with it. The cracks began to widen, the day Francis claimed he was heading to Bali alone for a wellness retreat. He said he needed clarity, a chance to reset after a stressful year. Alice didn't protest. She had long stopped expecting transparency from him. But something about the timing, the secrecy, didn't sit right. That night, curled up on the living room couch with a cup of tea, she scrolled through Jessica's public Instagram account. The second photo stunned her. A sunset view from a villa patio, complete with 2 wine glasses. The caption read, "New beginnings." 2 days later, another photo appeared. Jessica lounging beside a pool. A reflection in her sunglasses revealed the unmistakable profile of Francis in the background. Still, Alice didn't confront him. She'd learned by now that Francis thrived on deflection and drama. Instead, she kept documenting, quietly, strategically. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when she came home early from work, nursing a migraine. From the bedroom, she heard Francis in his home office, on the phone, speaking in a low, intimate tone. "Jessa, baby, it's all coming together. The beach house should sell quickly. Alice has no idea. Once that money hits our account, I'll move it offshore. By the time she figures it out, we'll be long gone." Alice didn't move. She lay perfectly still, absorbing every word. When the call ended, she got up, closed the door, and opened her desk drawer. The file labeled Francis Documentation was thicker than ever. The next morning, she made an appointment with Diane, their family attorney. Over coffee in Diane's office, Alice laid out the evidence: bank statements, photos, voice memos, even copies of Francis's drafted emails to a real estate agent about listing the Cape Cod house quietly. Diane didn't hesitate. "We need a forensic accountant, and we need to act fast." Within days, the accountant had uncovered a pattern of behavior so deliberate it made Alice's stomach turn. Francis had been siphoning money out of their accounts for months, carefully withdrawing sums just under the threshold that would trigger bank alerts. The total? Nearly $887,000, 0 cents. He had routed funds through a hidden secondary account and was preparing to wire them offshore. Then came the most devastating discovery: paperwork initiating the private sale of the beach house. The deed was in both their names, but Francis had instructed the real estate agent not to contact Alice. He had even falsely claimed she had already agreed to the sale. Armed with overwhelming evidence, Alice and Diane filed emergency court orders. Judge Martinez granted them immediately. All joint assets were frozen, including the secondary account and the beach house transaction. Any attempt to transfer large sums would trigger an alert. Financial guardian was appointed to monitor Francis's movements. Weeks later, when the infamous text arrived from Bali, Alice wasn't shocked. She was prepared. Francis thought he'd blindsided her. But what he didn't know was that his entire plan had already been dismantled by the very woman he had tried to erase. At 3:17 a.m., the glow of her phone lit up the bedroom once again. The text sat there like a smirking wound. "Sold our Cape Cod beach house and transferred all our savings to start my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless, LOL. Don't bother calling. Changing my number tomorrow." Alice read the message twice, then slowly set her phone on the nightstand. She exhaled deeply, her mind calm and focused. She picked the phone back up and typed just 4 words. "Check your account balance." She could almost see Francis half-draped in a linen robe in some Balinese villa, sipping a cocktail, confident he'd executed the perfect escape. But when he opened his banking app, he discovered the transfers had been intercepted. His access revoked, the offshore account flagged, the money securely rerouted to a court-monitored trust. 3 weeks earlier, Alice had taken the final step in a 6-month protection plan. Working closely with Diane and a forensic accountant, she had filed a series of emergency court motions. Judge Martinez had signed the freeze order within 24 hours. All joint assets were locked down. Any unauthorized withdrawals would trigger alerts and be stopped mid-transfectus. Francis had no idea his scheme was dead in the water. Alice opened the folder labeled Francis Timeline and flipped through the documentation. Years of statements, flagged transactions, scanned deeds, and legal correspondence. Every withdrawal, every email draft, every Instagram post had been logged. The sale of the beach house? Voided. The real estate agent had received the court order just in time to halt the process. Francis's offshore account? Flagged and reported. His U.S. passport? Frozen by court directive on the grounds of potential flight risk involving marital assets. As the sun began to rise, Alice brewed herself a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, preparing for the next phase. She picked up her phone again, not to text Francis, but to call her children. Thomas answered first, his voice groggy but alert the moment he heard his mother's tone. "Alice and I are coming over," he said without hesitation. An hour later, they were seated at the same kitchen table where they'd once done homework and birthday crafts. Now they were adults, absorbing the full weight of their father's betrayal. "You did the right thing," Thomas said, jaw tight. Elise blinked through tears but nodded. "We'll get through this, Mom." With their support, Alice pressed forward. She met with Diane later that morning, delivering updated logs and call transcripts. They went over the case file again, making sure every base was covered. Every time Francis attempted to move, he'd be met with a wall of court orders and documentation. The man who had tried to leave her with nothing, who had laughed as he texted from paradise, was about to learn what it meant to underestimate a woman who didn't fight with fists or fury, but with foresight, paper trails, and the full force of the law. Francis finally checked his account around mid-morning, Boston time. Alice's phone buzzed within minutes. The caller ID glared with his name. She let it ring 4 times, drawing a breath to steady herself before answering. "Alliance, what the hell did you do?" Francis's voice cracked with fury and disbelief. "Where's the money? You can't just—" "I protected what was ours," Alice said, her voice level. "The court has been aware of your actions for weeks. The evidence has been filed. The assets are frozen. You didn't get away with anything." "This is my money," Juve croaked. "My money," she corrected, "built over 30 years of marriage. I've presented everything to the court, including your attempt to sell my family beach house behind my back, including your recorded conversation about leaving me with nothing." There was a long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Jessica's panicking," he muttered. "She didn't sign up for this." "Neither did I," Alice replied. "But unlike Jessica, I didn't jump into a relationship with a married man and help him set up offshore accounts." "I'll fight this," Francis growled. "Good," Alice said simply. "Because you'll be fighting me, and the law." Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed again, this time with an email. The sender, Jessica. The message was unexpectedly formal. Jessica claimed she had been misled by Francis, told that the beach house was his inheritance, and that Alice had agreed to divorce amicably months earlier. "I would never have gotten involved had I known the truth," she wrote. "Please understand that I am ending our relationship immediately." Alice didn't reply. Instead, she forwarded the email to Diane. Within the hour, Diane had added it to the court file and informed the judge's clerk. Jessica's statements might be an attempt to shield herself from legal exposure, but they also helped Alice's case. "She's trying to separate herself before this sinks further," Diane said during their call. "But the court will see the pattern. And now, we have written confirmation that Francis lied to her too." That evening, Alice opened the door to find Michael, Francis's older brother, standing on her porch. He was holding a briefcase and wore an expression that mixed concern, shame, and resolve. "I just landed," he said. "I read everything." They sat at her dining table, spreading out the documents she'd spent months compiling. "This isn't just poor judgment," Michael said slowly, flipping through bank records and transcripts. "It's premeditated financial abandonment." He pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly shaken. "My brother's lost his mind. Dad would be ashamed." Alice met his eyes. I didn't want to believe it either, but I couldn't ignore the signs. Michael nodded. You did everything right, Alice. The evidence is solid, and I want you to know, whatever you need, I'm here. The next morning, Diane called with an update. The court had scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday. Frances would be required to attend, either in person or via video conference. A court financial guardian would also be present. By midday, Frances's attorney had been officially served. Alice received confirmation via email, along with another note from Diane. He knows now, and so does the court. As the weekend crept in, Alice found herself surrounded by support. Thomas and Elise returned home and stood by her, determined and proud. Her quiet strength had pulled them through the shock. Frances had tried to leave her homeless. Instead, he had triggered the collapse of his own fantasy and exposed himself as the architect of his own downfall. Of course, here's the 700-word section you requested, written exactly to length and styled for text-to-speech. Frances arrived back in Boston on a gray Monday evening, looking nothing like the smug, tanned man who had sent that heartless text from Bali just days earlier. As he stepped off the plane at Logan International Airport, 2 uniformed court officers approached him at the terminal. His face drained of color as they handed him the summons, an emergency court hearing scheduled for the following morning. He was stunned. Everything he had hoped to evade in paradise was now waiting for him at home. The next morning, Alice sat at the plaintiff's table in the marble-floored courtroom. Her back was straight, her expression calm. Diane sat beside her, legal folders neatly stacked. Behind them, Thomas and Elise flanked their Uncle Michael, a silent yet powerful show of support. Alice didn't look at Frances as he entered the room with his lawyer. He looked smaller than she remembered, hunched and pale in an ill-fitting blazer. Judge Martinez entered and began proceeding swiftly. "We are here on the matter of Mercer versus Mercer," she stated, scanning the file before her. "This court has received serious allegations regarding financial fraud, attempted asset concealment." Frances's attorney, Gregory Powell, stood. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges that mistakes were made. This situation arose from a period of emotional instability, a midlife crisis, if you will. My client never intended to cause lasting harm." Alice didn't flinch, but her hands folded tighter in her lap. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "A midlife crisis does not explain weeks of structured cash withdrawals, offshore transfers, and property negotiations behind the spouse's back. Nor does it excuse sending a message suggesting Holmesline as a punchline." Next, Diane introduced the forensic accountant Alice had hired months earlier. He stepped forward with a thick report. "Over a 4-month period," the expert began, "Mr. Mercer withdrew nearly $887,000, 0 cents, from various accounts. Always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic notifications. He opened a separate bank account in his name only, into which most of these funds were deposited. He displayed charts showing the timing of the withdrawals, matching them to Frances's supposed business trips. Then came a video testimony from the real estate agent Frances had secretly contacted to sell the Cape Cod beach house. I was instructed to list the property discreetly and avoid sending documents to Mrs. Mercer," the agent said. "When I asked about the title, Mr. Mercer said his wife had signed off, but when the court order arrived, I immediately froze the listing." Judge Martinez listened carefully. "Has this court received confirmation of this recording?" "Yes, Your Honor," Diane said, passing the transcript forward. The judge reviewed it and then turned her eyes to Frances. "You were fully aware of what you were doing," she said. "This wasn't a crisis. It was a calculated betrayal." Frances stood. "I was trying to build a new life. I felt trapped. Jessica, she made things feel different. I thought..." The judge cut him off. "You thought you could erase 30 years of marriage with a text message and walk off with everything your wife helped build. But now that I've made the decision to leave the law firm with my acting partner eyes on it, the violations are still the same. You have to go through it yourself." She then looked to Alice. "Mrs. Mercer, thank you for your diligence and the clarity of your documentation. This court finds your claims substantiated and the actions of your husband for the full 24 hours allowed. That is all." Deliberating a minute, she then said, "I am not at the mercy of any deliberating committee." She turned to the clerk. "The temporary asset protection orders will remain in place. The Cape Cod Beach House and the Boston home are to be granted to Mrs. Mercer for exclusive use during proceedings." Gasps echoed softly behind Alice. Elise touched her mother's shoulder gently. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court assigns a financial guardian to monitor all marital assets. Mr. Mercer is hereby ordered to surrender his passport and restricted from transferring funds beyond court appointos. Any future attempts to circumvent these orders will result in criminal contempt charges." Gregory Powell sat down slowly, defeated. Frances looked around the room, desperate for sympathy that wasn't there. As court adjourned, Frances tried to approach Alice, but Michael stepped forward. "Don't," he said firmly. Alice rose calmly and walked out of the courtroom, her children close behind. The tide had turned. Her quiet strategy had brought her to this moment, not just to defend what was hers, but to reclaim her power after years of invisibility. The betrayal had been public, but now, so was her strength, of course. Here's the 600-word 7, Fallout and Karma section for story number 22, written in a text-to-speech friendly style, and exactly to length. 6 months after the courtroom showdown, the dust had begun to settle. The divorce was finalized just 3 weeks earlier, ending 30 years of marriage with the stroke of a judge's pen. Alice sat on the back deck of the Cape Cod Beach House, her beach house now, watching the tide roll in under an October sunset that bathed the water in warm shades of gold and crimson. The quiet was calming, peaceful, a feeling that had eluded her for far too long. The final settlement had been decisive. The court awarded Alice full ownership of both the Cape Cod Beach House and the Boston brownstone. She received 70% of their retirement savings, control of remaining investment accounts, and the full reimbursement of all legal fees incurred throughout the proceedings. The judge had emphasized Frances's deliberate intent to commit financial fraud and emotional abandonment, making it clear that fairness was not a guiding principle in her life and holdings. She had received 70% of her Arkan savings, guiding her ruling. Meanwhile, Frances's world had crumbled. His employer, a prestigious corporate firm in Boston, had wasted no time distancing itself from him once the story became public. Media coverage had been discreet, but pointed. A respected attempting to defraud his wife of 30 years and flee to Bali with a much younger woman was not the kind of attention any firm wanted. He was let go quietly, with a bland statement about internal restructuring. The truth circulated in whispers across boardrooms and back channels. Jessica, unsurprisingly, didn't stay long after the money disappeared. Her email to Alice had been formal, almost apologetic, in claiming that Frances had ripped her offensively in their marital status and the ownership of the beach house. She said she never would have become involved had she known the truth. Whether or not that was sincere didn't matter. Jessica was gone, having already moved on to another affluent target in Florida, according to Michael. As for Frances, he was renting a modest apartment on the outskirts of Cambridge and had taken a position teaching night classes at a local community college. Business ethics. The irony of it all would have been laughable if it hadn't been so sad. Alice didn't relish his fall from grace. She had never wanted revenge. All she ever wanted, protect, and in the end, she got exactly that. Her life was rebuilding in quiet, meaningful ways. She had returned to her work at the hospital with renewed focus, taking on a leadership role in financial policy, helping other women on staff understand and secure their long-term planning. Thomas and Elise visited often, proud of their mother, and grateful that she had stood strong through the storm. Michael, now more than just her ex-brother-in-law, had become a trusted friend and legal advisor, helping her navigate the transition with clarity and confidence. Alice had also started journaling again, something she hadn't done in years. Her words were no longer filled with confusion or fear. They were filled with reflection, resolve, and a surprising sense of calm. What Frances had tried to take from her, security, legacy, identity, She had reclaimed on her own terms. He had reclaimed on her own terms. And now, as the waves whispered against the shore and a soft breeze danced through the seagrass, Alice smiled to herself, not because Francis had lost, but because she had won. Not just the legal battle, but the fight for her own peace of mind. For the first time in years, she felt fully in control of her life. And that, she realized, was the most satisfying justice of all. 1 year after receiving the devastating text from Francis, Alice Mercer stood confidently at the front of a conference room at Boston University's Event Center. The banner behind her read, "Financial Security After Betrayal." Over 200 attendees filled the room, mostly women over 50, with many with tearful eyes and notebooks in hand, hoping to learn how to protect themselves from the kind of betrayal Alice had once thought could never happen to her. She took a breath and began her keynote speech. Her voice was steady, her message clear. Preparation isn't paranoia. Documentation isn't distrust. They're forms of self-protection, something everyone deserves. The audience nodded, some visibly emotional. Alice walked them through her story not to evoke sympathy, but to share practical strategies and warning signs. The very betrayal that nearly destroyed her had now become the foundation of a new mission, empowering others to protect themselves, financially and legally, before it was too late. Her story had gained attention in the months after the divorce settlement. The Boston Globe ran a feature titled, "Betrayed but Not Broken," which detailed her meticulous preparation, the emergency court orders, and the courtroom battle that resulted in a landmark ruling. The response had been overwhelming. Dozens of women reached out, many sharing similar experiences of financial manipulation and emotional deception. Alice realized then that what happened to her wasn't unique, but talking about it openly could be revolutionary. She teamed up with Diane, her loyal and brilliant attorney, as well as several financial experts, including a forensic accountant who had helped her case. Together, they created a workshop series focused on spotting early signs of financial abuse, how to discreetly gather evidence, and what legal steps to take before confronting a partner. These workshops became a lifeline for women navigating difficult and dangerous situations, offering both legal education and emotional validation. Thomas and Alice were there that day, sitting proudly in the front row. Michael, her former brother-in-law, had also attended, offering legal insights during a panel discussion. Their presence reminded Alice that family didn't always mean shared blood. It meant standing by someone even after the worst storms had passed. Alice never imagined she'd become a public speaker, let alone an advocate for others. But life had a way of reshaping pain into purpose. Her days were now filled with meaning, whether mentoring a woman just beginning to suspect her husband's betrayal, or helping someone quietly set up legal safeguards to protect inherited property. Though she didn't seek fame, Alice's work was being recognized across Boston and beyond. She was invited to speak on podcasts, contribute to financial planning publications, and even consulted on legislation aimed at strengthening protections against financial abuse within marriages. Standing under the soft lighting of the conference room, with applause rising around her, Alice didn't feel like a victim, or even just a survivor. She felt like a leader, a guide, and most importantly, a woman who had transformed betrayal into a source of lasting power, for herself and for others. The Cape Cod breeze was cool against Alice Mercer's face as she walked barefoot along the familiar shoreline, her favorite mug of tea cupped gently in her hands. The ocean stretched out before her, endless and calm. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting soft gold across the water. This beach, once a battleground for her heart and legacy, now stood as a symbol of survival and serenity. The house behind her, the same one Francis tried to sell without her knowing, was hers again, secured not just by law but by foresight, resolve, and sheer willpower. The drama of the past year had finally settled into memory. The betrayal, the courtroom battles, the desperate voicemails and laughable attempts at apologies. They no longer consumed her. In their place stood clarity, strength, peace. Thomas and Alice would arrive soon for dinner, bringing stories from their new jobs and lives. Alice smiled at the thought. Her family, once rocked by her husband's deception, had not just endured. It had deepened in loyalty and love. She paused at the water's edge, letting the waves brush over her feet. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't fighting back. She reclaimed herself. The tide rolled in again, gentle and steady, as Alice turned toward the house. Her future, she had rebuilt on her own terms.